Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and my co-host, Derek, is not with us today. But we do have a full show, so I grabbed a couple of good friends from upstairs. This is the property tax show. This is the one we're gonna be diving deep into the issue of property taxes. It's probably one of the most reviled issues, maybe, in Texas. It's not one of the sexiest issues that's on the front pages of the media all the time. But when you ask Texans about it, it is one of the things that they are the most heated and the most emotional and most passionate about. And we'll get to some of those poll results. But first, let me introduce my guests today. My guests are Jose Melendez, who is our campaign manager for our Taxpayer Protection Project, and our policy director for that same campaign is James Quintero. And these folks are, I'm sure if you're familiar with TPPF, you're familiar with both of them. They've multiple testimonies before the state, written a ton on a lot of these issues, fighting the good fight on all kinds of issues like taxpayer-funded lobbying and trying to keep our taxes low and keep spending responsible. So, Jose, James, thanks for being on the show.
Glad to be here.
Get after it. Go. Yeah. Let me give it to me. The property taxes. Let's go.
Well, I was just going to razz you a little bit for finally coming on camera and calling us good friends. Jose and I are.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Wait, y'all are not good friends, or you're not friends of the show?
No. We finally got you on camera calling us good friends.
Oh, okay. Well, we're going to, Jefferson, we're going to edit that out here at the beginning. Well, we do like to do something a little fun here at the beginning. And so, first of all, just because you guys are our taxpayer protection folks, I had to ask about the 50-year mortgage. I mean, maybe Trump wasn't as serious about this as maybe he, for when he first threw it out there, because ever since the last 48 hours, it's been like, well, no, it's like, whatever. It's kind of an idea. I was just kind of throwing it around. James, did you have a heart attack when you heard about the 50-year mortgage?
Would I do it personally? No. But, so long as people are not forced to go that route, then, perhaps it makes sense in some rare instances. I think it does perhaps speak to the larger affordability crisis that we're all enduring right now. Mm-hmm. It seems like the administration is throwing everything against the wall in order to really get to the heart of this problem. Now, again, is this the most effective solution? I don't think so. Mm-hmm. But maybe it makes sense in some rare instances.
Jose, 50-year mortgage or reverse mortgage? What's the least responsible?
To agree with James that this should be optional. And when I think about what the state legislature did on housing affordability, we passed a host of solutions. I think everything should be on the table. Anything that would help us bring more supply on the market, make it more, make homeownership more reachable for young families.
Speaking of on the table, I do want to point out your Death Star mug, which is fantastic. I don't know if we can get a close up of that, but that is awesome. Is so it's the Death Star with the Texas Lone Star in the middle of the Death Star.
So if I recall correctly, this idea, kudos to Speaker Burrows, who, when he was a member of the House, was the champion on this bill. That he was also a big fan of posting tweets with the Death Star, Darth Vader, and that's where the idea came from, and that's how we got the mug.
All right, so the hot take is, the hot take was not the 50-year mortgage, but I had you here, so I had to ask you. But the hot take is, we're now past Halloween. We're halfway in through November. I don't know about you, but but my house is already exploding with Christmas trees and ornaments and everything. In your households, do you put up Christmas decorations before Thanksgiving?
Now, if you'd asked that question 5 years ago, it'd been no. But there's something that's happened over the last 5 years, whether it's Netflix pushing these Christmas movies before Halloween.
Hallmark.
And I feel like I've just followed the trend. And so Christmas tree is already up in the house.
Well, 5 years ago, you're a young guy. So 5 years ago, you probably weren't even putting up decorations at all. It was maybe a stocking or something. James?
5 years ago, I hit 40. And that was the last time that I found myself on the roof hanging Christmas lights. And it occurred to me that if I fall off the roof, I don't heal like I used to. And so ever since then, we've started to just pay some folks to come and hang Christmas lights for us. So those Christmas lights go up whenever the folks come out and hang them.
Oh, man, I thought your story was going to be 5 years ago, I put up Christmas lights and I just left them up every year and left them on because I'm worried about dying because I have a family to feed. No, I hear you. I think 2 years ago, I started putting up the lights on our house, and it is treacherous. We don't have a two-story house or anything. And then, once you get up there and you're like, this is the angle I'm supposed to navigate here, trying to jump up on here. So anyway, so yes, for us, 100%, definitely inside the house. It's like an explosion. We had family in town over the weekend, just like an explosion of Christmas trees just came up. I went to work one day and on Monday and came back and like it was just Christmas trees everywhere. So I guess the hint is, hey, get that ladder, get going, get the lights up. So I think we're all yes on that. Okay, so something a little less fun, but probably just as important as Christmas, property taxes. It's one of those issues that, like I said, is not the sexy issue. It's not the one that's going to animate any kind of election or any kind of federal election, or the presidents and most politicians aren't going to be talking about it. But here in Texas, they are, and in fact, just the opposite. Greg Abbott launched his re-election bid this weekend, and that was the number one thing. Just like he did with school choice 4 years ago, he talked about reforming property taxes and finally getting a handle on property taxes. So set the stage for one more thing, and then I'll turn it over to you, James, to kind of just like, where are we in terms of property taxes? Two things I'll point out. One, polling. We've asked this question for the last 7 years on almost every poll that we've ever done, and we ask to Texans, are property taxes a major burden for you and your family? Are they a major burden for you and your family? And generally, it fluctuates. It's high. It's like 70 to 75% will say, yes, it's a major burden. Earlier this year, the highest we've ever recorded, 83% of Texans now say that they're a major burden, including 65% of Texans that strongly agree that they're a major burden. And why? Well, I would point to a graph that was compiled by our friends over at Texas Policy Research. Jefferson's going to throw it up on the screen for us, but here it is. This is the growth in property taxes from 1998 until 2024, and you can see, there's a gradual growth until you hit about 2014, and then it's just a hockey stick. It's just explodes, and this is what we're paying. James, why? Why did this happen?
That is a $1 million question. So, and there's really two main things going on here. One relates to bond elections, and the other has to do with rate hikes. And let's take those two on independently. By the way, I think there's probably some other factors influencing the growth of tax levies, like the receipt of federal monies, and perhaps the absence of any real spending limitations. But let's just go with bond elections and rate hikes for now. So if you consider what happened over the last few weeks on Election Day, what we saw is about 500 separate measures pitched independently, aside from the constitutional amendments. So about 500 different measures, potentially worth $91.3 billion, right?
So tax increase. So on the election, there were tax increases on the election, and if they had all passed, it would have increased the taxes by $91 billion.
Kind of, and here's why we have to be careful. So those are big numbers that we're dealing with. Again, 500 different ballot propositions worth about $91.3 billion. What that includes, though, is a mix of new debt, refunding bonds, and bonds pitched by certain types of local governmental entities known as special purpose districts. So, for instance, if you have a municipal utility district that's trying to get infrastructure in the ground and a community built up, those were part of that $91.3 billion.
Yeah, I think on that graph that we showed, that bottom line, that black line, is the SPDs.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Okay.
So, and when you consider MUDs, they do serve a very useful function, and in the constellation of governmental entities, they are some of the least offensive because people voluntarily choose to move there, right? But let's set that issue to the side. So we've got 500 bonds, about $91.3 billion. There's no real comprehensive data set yet to show how many of those bonds passed, but word on the street is probably about 40% failed. right? And that's a fairly rough estimate. There's some flex in the numbers.
Texas Tribune reported, I just pulled that, they said about half. So we're
Really?
numbers,
Okay,
yeah. So they haven't announced, they didn't post their analysis, but they said it was about half failed.
Which is fascinating, and I want to pull on that thread in just a minute. So how does that 40% failure rate compare to the past? Well, Bond Review Board has some interesting data which shows that if you look at the average annual passage rates for the 5 years between 2020 and 2024, the average annual passage rate is about 80%. Right? So if we compare what just happened with what has happened in the past, you can see there's a big discrepancy there.
For sure.
And I think that gets to your earlier point about about voters being frustrated with the current state of affairs. Now, what we have to be careful about a little bit when talking about the failure rate is what I think happened is voters rejected the little stuff. They rejected the frills or the repairs or things that ought to have been paid with through the maintenance and operations budget. And they want governments to go back and figure those things out. But for the big ticket items, there was still a lot of and so what I did is Bond Review Board has a bond election database, and it lists all of these different 500 propositions. And what I did is I weeded through that database to see, well, for those that aren't special purpose district related, because those exist in a category unto themselves, or for those that weren't refunding bonds, how many of the big ones passed? And so I took the top 3, and I'll share with you what I found. So the largest non-refunding bond pitched to voters was Lamar CISD's Proposition A, and that was for a new school construction and repairs. It cost about $1.9 billion. That's principal only.
Wow.
Usually the interest factor adds anywhere between 50 to 100% depending on the district.
Wow.
So we're talking about a significant bond item that was passed by 55% of the voters. The second largest measure was Richardson ISD's Proposition A, and that pitched a new career and technical education center along with repairs. That was another $1.3 billion single item bond proposition that passed with 64%. Now, the third largest item actually failed. And that was Van Alstyne's Proposition A, which pitched voters on new schools, maintenance, and a new admin building. And that was for $550 million. So you can see there's somewhat mixed results at the top, at least. And I think that the further down that list you go to those smaller ticket items, voters probably were a bit more skeptical on, the smaller, less costly things, while still approving the large expenditures for new school buildings. So there's some reasonability built in there, at least on the part of the voter.
Let me get Jose's take here, right here at the beginning. Jose, how are you viewing this? What do you see as the biggest problem for driving up property taxes?
Yeah, so to your original question about why taxpayers are fed up, I think the dynamic in play is that local budgets are growing faster than family incomes. This isn't a problem about, revenue. The revenue's there. It's what these entities are spending the money on. They're overspending, and a lot of times they're spending money on, it's things like left coast ideas, things they shouldn't be doing.
Like $1 million logos, for example?
Correct. Things of that nature. Taxpayer-funded abortions, what have you. And to James's point about bond elections, I think part of the problem, too, is November versus May elections. And the governor's talked about this, the need for a November uniform election date. So I want to highlight a couple of major counties, and I want to play on that dynamic between November versus May. So in the past May election, Harris County had a turnout of just 2% out of registered voters. You compare that to the prior November election, it was 43%. That's a huge drastic difference in turnout. Dallas County, this past May, had an 8.5% turnout. The November prior to that election, they had a 58% turnout. Another drastic difference. Just one more. Bexar County had a turnout in May of 9%. the turnout in November prior to that election was 58%.
Yeah.
Another drastic difference. And so this, feeds into what the governor's talking about, the need for not just a uniform election date, but on top of that, a supermajority approval so that we get an actual representation of what the community wants.
Yeah, we'll get to the agenda, the governor's agenda sort of towards the end.
One more item on bonds before we shift. I think there is a general sense of frustration out there, but I do want to give credit to the legislature for passing Senate Bill 1025 last session, because transparency is a big part of this too. And what existed prior to the implementation of this law is a requirement that school districts state on the ballot, hey, this bond that we're pitching you guys, this is a property tax increase. Now, what we noticed since the passage of that law back in 2019 up to this session was school districts were getting crafty, and they were hiding the language from voters, and they would do so by, burying it at the bottom of the proposition language, or they'd smash it between English and Spanish versions, and they do other things to mute the language. So what the ledge did this time is they took that statement and they put it at the very top.
I noticed that.
And they required cities and counties to also observe the requirement. So now any governmental type that is pitching a bond has to state at the very top, hey, this is a tax increase. And also they have to do that for VATREs. Mm-hmm. So your voter approval tax rate elections now also include that language at the top. And I think that extra bit of information really helps voters make the connection between new debt and new taxes. Mm-hmm. So
a couple of things I want to get into here and try to not be on my soapbox. I do want to get your thoughts on this, but we've always seen through the polling and frankly through just the way that government works over the last decades, for several decades, taxpayers generally, if they feel like the money is going to go towards something that they support, if it's going to go to improve education or provide high-end facilities for the kids, or if it's going to go to help healthcare for the poor, or if it's going to go to pay for cops and improve public safety, whether or not we like it, high taxes or not, the fact is the general public, Texans, will support more spending on those things, and we've seen that election after election if they believe that's what it's going to. I think where we've hit a tipping point now is that people are realizing that they're not spending the money on those things, right? So, for example, we here at TPPF have been going through and the line items in the books, particularly amongst what they're spending on education, and we see that 60% of all spending in education does not get into the classroom. 36%, $36 billion goes to contractors and lobbyists and consultants, and so now people are saying, wait a minute, I thought I was spending all this money because I was trying to improve grades and I'm trying to, improve the kids' education. And now we're seeing that it's going to line the pockets of fat cats in Austin. I think that's the tipping point. The Austin American Statesman article that came out right before this election demonstrating that city government was wasting money. And it wasn't a lot of money. It was like tens of thousands of dollars on lunches and, a couple of, checks to some nonprofits and things like that. But the point wasn't the amount of money. It was the judgment that our local officials, or the lack of judgment that our local officials are showing in how this money is spent, that drove people's opposition to improving even more money. People are saying, look, I don't have a problem giving you more money if it's going to go to improve the roads and it's going to make the streets safer. But if you're using it to go to Sweet Green every day, then no, you need to cut back. Do you see the same way I do? Are you seeing maybe even more trends, encouraging trends moving in that direction?
Well, that you've lost the plot when the Austin American Statesman criticizes your tax increase, right? So let's get into this VATRE issue, right? Or let's get into the rate hike issue, because I think it very much is involved with what you're talking about. So as opposed to the bonds, rate hikes generally involve your maintenance and operations tax rate. And this is supposed to pay for day-to-day things, salary, supplies, etc. So what the legislature has done in the past is they've modernized the property tax revenue limit to institute a 3.5% revenue trigger. So a government can go out and seek more revenue than 3.5%, but they have to get a vote of the people. And that's where the VATRE concept comes in. Anytime you hear VATRE, that generally refers to a large tax increase that's subject to voter approval. And you saw a lot of VATREs this time around. And I think much like the bond situation, there was a healthy mix of passage and failures. And I've seen some data to suggest that maybe it's right around half and half also. Mm-hmm. So you have to wonder, well, what prompted voters to reject all of these various encroachments, whether it's, from a city, county, or a school district? And again, the data is not real clear because we don't have a centralized database with which to inform the discussion. But we can take a look at some of these instances and see that, very clearly there was overreach. Austin is the most obvious example. Their VATRE would have resulted in a 20% tax rate hike. And that was a hard pill to swallow, not only knowing that they had a $6 billion budget on the table, which is far and away the largest budget on a per capita basis of any in Texas, but also back to your earlier point that they were misspending on logos and fancy lunches and retirement parties. And by the way, the city manager is the highest, to my knowledge, the city manager is the highest paid city manager in Texas. Mm-hmm. And so for that person to come hat in hand to the public saying, hey, we need a 20% rate hike because we're out of money, there's just something disingenuous about the entire affair. Mm-hmm. But of course, it's not just Austin that had a VATRE. You also, down closer to our neck of the woods, you had a 12-cent tax rate hike proposed by Hays CISD. Hays is one of those areas where people who can't afford Austin have fled to because it offers, a bit more in terms of affordability. For that community to come at voters with a 12-cent tax rate hike was a bit of a surprise. And it also, I think, led to something of a miniature taxpayer revolt in that community where 61% of the electorate said no.
I was shocked. I was shocked to see Hays County vote against it. I mean, Austin maybe because, especially with the article that came out and everything, but for it to organically fail in Hays County, I thought was really surprising.
It was. And again, you have another situation there where the superintendent is paid handsomely. There are poor student outcomes in that district. And there's all sorts of rumblings behind the scenes about, wanting fancy new buildings for the district. And so I think all of these things kind of led to a mixture of rejection. Now, it wasn't like this everywhere. If you go to North Texas, we were able to track 9 different VATREs in North Texas, 7 of which were successful. In fact, only... those districts include Bland, Carroll, Crandall, Denton, Garland, HEB, Northwest, Rockwall, and Peaster ISD. So there was a large movement up there toward higher taxes, and voters seemed to support those things.
So there's some education we need.
There is some education, or, it could be in some of those circumstances, perhaps the needs were legitimate. We just don't know yet. But again,
let me jump on that just a little bit because Jose had mentioned, uniform election dates, and it's not just about the uniformity of the election date to get people to show up to weigh in on this, but it's also educating them about the bonds. I mean, a lot of stuff that James has already talked about what those bonds will do to your property taxes, and putting on there this is a tax increase. We had some polling I think earlier in this year. I want to throw this at you and get your reaction to it. We asked how familiar. This is all Texans as Texas registered voters. How familiar are you with who sets your property taxes for your home? only 50% said that they understood the details. 23% said that they understood the details and could explain them to others. 27% said, I'm familiar but can't explain it to other people. So even only 50% even say that they kind of understand their property taxes in general. 43% said either they had heard about the process but don't know the details, or said, I have no idea how my property taxes are set. 43%, all these people are paying all this money, hundreds of dollars every single month, thousands of dollars every year, and 43% can't even explain, don't even know how it all works. The second question we asked is, the elected officials who bear the most responsibility for my property tax bill are only 50% got it right and said local elected officials. 35% said state elected officials. And 3% said federal officials. So I don't know what those guys are thinking. 12% said they didn't know. So you've got 47% that that either just don't know, or more than that. You got 50% that said they just don't know or they get it wrong. Is that part of the problem in terms of why local officials feel like with impunity they can just go out and raise everybody's taxes?
So when we look at these bonds, and James pointed out a few. We don't live in some of these areas like Rockwall ISD or some of you do live in Hayes ISD, but the people in these communities do, and a lot of times they get their education from political action committees, and a lot of times those folks have interests at hand, right? They want to ensure passage of the bond by any means possible. And I think that's part of why we're seeing this 50-50 split in terms of like passage and failure of bonds, which in the past it's been 80% passage. Because I think folks are starting to see through some of this messaging, right? A lot of these special interests come at you and they say, hey, it's for the children. That's why you need this Taj Mahal high school stadium. I was in East Texas a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking to a former candidate for school board out there. She's very engaged in the community, and she said, look, they're selling it as it's for the children. Not only that, they're actually out there pimping the kids. I was like, what do you mean? They're actually parading the kids out at these events that are paid by these PACs, getting the community involved, and telling them how to vote. Like explicitly saying, yes, you need to vote for Prop A out here. Prop A, which comes along with $2 million worth of debt. So I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing this split. Folks are seeing past this kind of messaging, and in conversations over the last 2 or 3 weeks, this is an issue that's been front of mind for a lot of folks.
And it's obviously not illegal for a teacher to run out there and say, hey, somebody should support a bond, but certainly not from a ISD standpoint. It's not legal for them to do any kind of electioneering or organizing or certainly pressuring or compelling teachers or other employees to go out there and push this kind of stuff, right? I mean, we don't need to fix that. That should be in the law.
And part of that, yes. So, I mean, they're doing it in terms of like outdoor picnics, come and get some free pizza, free beer, or presentations at the actual schools where the superintendent is actually telling them about yes for Prop A. And this gets at a larger problem, right? It goes back into the profiteer stuff where these people are making money out of this. I think what we're going to see is a lot of interest because we're seeing examples like this from across the state. People are coming forth. They're not afraid anymore. And they're coming to us. It's like, what can we do?
What you guys have been kind of talking around, which I want to put a finer point on, is that, this kind of thing, the property taxes is driven by spending. It's all driven by spending. It's borrowing the money, the hundreds of billions of dollars for bonds. It's raising taxes because they're spending too much money or spending a ton of money for God knows what. And, in looking through the books and so a lot of it's very questionable. But it's all driven by spending. And so... there have obviously over the last several legislatures, there have been attempts by the state, James, to get a handle on this. Like it's, the state does not, this is one thing we need to be clear about, talking about the education. The state does not impose a property tax. The state cannot cut your property taxes. They cannot cut your property tax rate. Like the state does not impose it. It's zero. There's no way to. It's constitutionally prohibited. But but the state talks a lot about it, James. They talk a lot about trying to lower your property taxes. So one is that are they putting themselves in a difficult position by talking about it, and yet they're not really the ones who are in control of it? And then what have they done over the last 3 or 4 sessions, and how has that, what are they trying to do to try and lower the property taxes? Because they do talk a lot about it.
Well, it's a good question. I don't fully let the legislature off the hook for property taxes, because when you consider the nature of the system, cities, counties, school districts, and the rest are extensions of state authority, right? And the legislature is fully within its rights to curtail bad behavior or impose restraints or tell them to knock it off, right? But there's not been enough of that activity yet. We have not yet reached the moment where the legislature has found it prudent to institute a local government spending limit, or serious debt restrictions, or balanced budget requirements, right? We're not there yet. I think we're moving in that direction, but thus far the legislature has been content to allow local government shenanigans to persist. And so, yes, local governments are primarily to blame, but the legislature isn't off the hook in total. Now, one of the things we did moving into the 2025 legislative session is we looked at the data. We wanted to see, look, is there actually a legitimate case to be made here that local governments are overspending, or perhaps are we imagining it? Is it just all in our minds that local governments are spending too much? And so one of the things we did is we looked at 5 large counties and 5 large cities, and we dug through their budgets to grab about 5 years worth of data and match that up with population and inflation trends in those communities. And we want to say, look, are these budgets actually growing faster than population and inflation, or again, are we imagining things?
Which, by the way, is a reasonable measure. I mean, if your population's growing, obviously you have more people, you're going to spend more. And then inflation, if things cost more, you're going to spend more. So totally reasonable to say, look, if you're staying at population and inflation increases, completely reasonable that you would need more money to pay for more people that are there, and the fact that things cost more.
Yeah. And so what we found is that of those 5 large cities, 4 of the 5 had budgets that were outpacing population and inflation. In fact, to my surprise, only the city of Houston had maintained a growth rate below that metric.
Wow.
So kudos, city of Houston.
All right.
Among the counties, over the 5-year period that we studied from 2019 to 2023, only Collin County had a budget growth rate less than population and inflation. So for the most part, 4 of the 5 counties are overspending what we as conservatives have identified as the ideal metric. So on the basis of the data, what that suggests is, yes, Texas legislature, there is evidence to suggest we do need a local spending limit. Now, you raised a point earlier. Well, what are we spending this money on? And is it going to things that we need? We don't have that level of detail yet, but I can tell you there are lots of examples, lots of instances highlighted in the newspaper every day that suggests it's not going to things that dramatically improve public service. It's going to enrich the pockets of a few, those at the very top of public service, or it's going toward rent seekers and profiteers, and it's enriching that cadre, or it's just being wasted. I can't help but again call attention to the city of Austin's new city manager, who apparently has a penchant for sweet green. He's just going out and having fancy lunches. Like, that's just blatant waste.
Yeah.
And that's rampant throughout all of your various cities and counties because, again, there is nothing really constricting how they spend or forcing them to prioritize in any meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, that article, and they really just did a deep dive on the credit card expenditures, right, by the city council. I mean, that's how they got that data. It's really hard to get some of this like bottom level, foundational data to understand what the city is spending all of this money on. And so, one, it's hard to even understand what they're spending the money on. But then, even then, once you find out, or maybe some of these bonds that are, that are making these Taj Mahal facilities, the question is, even if it's something like a gymnasium or a new school that needs to get built, did it need to cost $400 million? Like, what is there not a way that we could have built that same facility to have all of the necessary things it needs for the kids at at $200 million or $300 million? And so you've got those two questions, which is, one, do we even need this thing in the first place, and all of the waste and stuff that you're talking about? But even the stuff that looks like things that we need, did it need to cost that much, or are these contractors and these lobbyists and others inflating these prices? So how do we get to, you guys are deep diving on this almost every day. Is there a way, number one, can you get to the data? Can you answer those two questions, or is it really difficult? And two, if it is really difficult, is there something the state could do to get it to require more transparency, or to require, frankly, more compliance? Because that's another thing that we find is, even when we ask the right questions, they spin you around and you've left. Was this a comma or a period? And then they take 6 months to get back to you on your request. And then even if you can get the data, a lot of it's redacted because it's like these contracts that they claim are, have proprietary information or whatever. So does more need to be done to improve, Jose, transparency and accountability, even within the stuff that we can get to?
Yeah, and I think to set the stage for that, and I want to rope in James for this one. So we all agree that local spending is a problem. We need greater transparency. Yes, the state of Texas is going to continue to experience growth. But that doesn't mean we need to stray away from a budget that adheres to population plus inflation. In fact, families do it every day. James, you're a father of 5. When you think about spending your family budget, are you buying the most expensive things for your kids, or do you have to make some clawbacks?
Oh my gosh, there have been so many clawbacks. We have done a lot to try and just afford groceries these days. As you can imagine, feeding 5 kids takes a lot. And so there's a lot of things we've had to rework in our own personal budget. I wish government would do just even half of what the average person has had to do to contend with the environment.
And that serves the point of, if families can do it, why aren't governments doing it? Why aren't they operating in the same fashion? If a family goes over budget, or that means maybe they don't make rent, next thing you're homeless, why can't governments don't suffer the same consequences?
Well, and here's what happens. And it happened literally 24 hours after Austin's VATRE was rejected, is that you had a city council member come out and say, well, I guess we got to cut police. I guess we got to cut EMS. I guess you're just going to have to deal with all the potholes and all of the necessary essential services that you would expect a government to be covering. They, of course, immediately after they lose the vote, they gaslight the public into thinking, oh well, then I guess we can't afford police officers and the ambulance isn't going to come to your door anymore.
Well, in the same vein, are families going to cut eggs and milk so they can keep the Peloton or the Netflix subscription?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And then that's the point. I mean, this is the point I was trying to make, whenever that councilwoman was doing this, is the problem with that is all the money they should have cut, the $1 million logo and the $1 million homeless mural and all that kind of stuff, all of that's been spent. So she's right in the sense that, like, they can't cut that stuff because the money's already out the door. Everything that's in front of them to cut is essential services, is the things like, that they haven't budgeted for next year, maybe 2027 or whatever. So they're looking at the big ticket items. But the reality is, if they had cut all of this waste from 2020 and 2022 and 2024, they would have have, I mean, all of that stuff that we did one blog post, and I think the stuff that we pointed out was about $15 million. That's half the budget deficit. That was half the budget deficit that they were trying to cover with this VATRE. So if they had cut all of that stuff, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, then they would have had the money. But now they're saying, oh, well, all that money's out the door. We can't claw that back any, so we got to go and reduce cops.
So I want to take you back a couple of years, and then and because it relates to this point, I want to say somewhere around the 2016 or 2017 timeframe, there was a local PAC that went out and solicited signatures in an attempt to force a vote on Prop K. And Prop K at that time would have required the city to undergo a third-party efficiency audit. And this PAC actually found success. It was a fairly reasonable idea at that time to say, hey, look, let's just open up the hood, check the engine, figure out, are all the things working properly? If some things are out of whack, maybe we take a look. And what was fascinating about that whole experience is at first, then Mayor Adler and crew really didn't take offense to the issue. In fact, I think they initially embraced Prop K because it's really hard to be against transparency and efficiency. But once AFSCME and the other unions got involved, city leadership very quickly became antagonistic toward the proposition and even alleged, I think they called it a Koch-funded conspiracy, right? To get in there and figure out, like, how is Austin spending money?
Which is what every family does almost on a monthly basis.
And I mention that because I think that very same problem that was so obvious then has only metastasized, and it's gotten worse today, where you have this special group of unions, rent seekers, and profiteers getting rich off of city government services or city government contracts, and they don't want any transparency or efficiency. They don't want anybody poking around. And if you come at them with, a rejected VATRE, then they're going to threaten you with the worst possible consequences to make you pay for that and never do that again.
So we know that tactic works, right? Because it scares people into supporting future tax increases down the road. But the legislature has responded to that. Governor Abbott signed into law, and the legislature passed. I think it was just in this last session, a law that forbids local governments from raising property taxes if they're not complying with the state's auditing requirements. So the states have an auditing requirement already on the books, and a new law says you can't raise taxes beyond a certain amount if you haven't done an audit on your books. Exactly what you're talking about. Like, we're trying to prevent them from using that tactic, which is, telling us, oh no, we already spent all this money, and so now we have to cut police. We say, no, you have to audit all the things you're spending money on first and be transparent about that. That way you can't make that argument that you have nowhere to cut. There were 4 cities. This is going on right now. There are 4 cities that tried to pass tax increases, or that did pass tax increases: Odessa, Lamarck, Tom Bean, and Whitesboro, that did pass tax increases without doing these audits. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton is now suing them, saying that they can't go forward with their tax increases because they're in violation of this new law. Jose, James, how is that going to play out?
I think it's funny you mentioned Whitesboro, because Whitesboro in the past has been a troublemaker. Not too long ago, they tried to pass a 30% tax increase. They tried to go under the radar, but people caught wind pretty quickly.
30% under the radar?
I'll give kudos to Representative Shelley Luther, who showed up in person to advocate against that increase at the city council meeting in which it was being presented.
Mm-hmm. What did they say?
Oh, they immediately went back on it.
Yeah, oh, really?
It was unsuccessful.
Oh, good.
Yeah,
okay.
the pushback from the public worked. And that goes to show a lot of the times they get away with this because they don't have a spotlight.
Yeah. But weren't
the public isn't engaged.
Didn't they say, weren't they one of the ones that said they didn't know the law had changed? They're like, we didn't know you were supposed to do this.
So James can chime in on this, but a lot of these cities, because they don't meet the population threshold, can go far beyond the percentage that is set for most other cities.
Yeah, so I believe Whitesboro is still tangled up with the Attorney General's office. What the city alleges is that the new law took effect in September. And they were already well underway with their fiscal adventures, adopting tax rates and budgets. And so they thought, well, that we're going to observe that new law, but we'll do it next year. But the law that was passed did not provide any allowance to political subdivisions to determine when they get to observe the law. It just said, hey, do this thing. And if you don't do this thing, then you're subject to these consequences. I think this gets to a larger problem, though, that we see exhibited throughout, which is this spirit of lawlessness where cities, counties, and school districts feel like they get to pick and choose which laws to follow. And that's simply not the case. We have a state government that passes laws that local governments must follow, just like you and I. And ignorance or non-compliance is not an excuse to just break state laws. In fact, if anything, local government officials are held to a higher standard because they're more visible, right? They are the ones who set the tenor for everybody else. And so I think things like this really need to be pursued in full, because if we allow it to fester, then we invite far more lawlessness into the process throughout the policymaking environment.
Yeah, it's not a good look either way. Either one, they're intentionally, knowingly violating the law, or two, why didn't they know about a law that deeply affects and has significant influence over how much money your city can raise? I mean, how much revenue that you can raise, or the procedure by which you would raise that revenue. The fact that they didn't know, I mean, to claim ignorance, I mean, they should all be thrown out of office as far as I'm concerned.
Especially when you consider that these cities pay dues to groups like the Texas Municipal League, who is supposed to provide legal assistance and legislative updates to these cities. So if they didn't know that these new laws were in effect and that they were going to have some bearing on their budgeting process, then that's a black eye on TML, and they really need to consider, the city needs to reconsider whether or not to participate in that group, because clearly it's not serving its useful function.
Well, let me get into another game that that the locals play, which is with appraisals. And then there's a couple of items that the governor's new plan deal with as well. Well, they'll say, that's another way to get at tax increases is, a lot of times they'll say, we're not raising your tax rates. In fact, sometimes they even lower your tax rate. But because the appraisal game is to, vastly over appraise houses, that even with the lower tax rate, you still pay more the next year because of that. James, what's being done to address that? Did I get that right, or is there more to it than that?
No, I think you got it right. And this gets back to the complication of the system. I go back to your earlier point. Most people don't even know who to point the blame to. They don't know whether federal, state, or local policymakers are in charge of the tax system. And then once you get involved or entangled with the tax system, there's a lot of shell games that get played that confuse the average person, so they don't even know which measure or metric to look at. One of local government's favorite games is they have a shell game they play with rates and values. And for anybody who doesn't necessarily understand the system, it actually operates in a relatively simplistic way, in that your rates multiplied by your values produces your tax bill, or in the case of a government, your tax levy. And for a long time, what local officials have done is said, well, we don't actually control value growth. That's a function of the appraisal district. And that's why your bills are going up, is your values are going up. And, if you're an average person who's busy raising a family, working, just trying to make it, that probably makes sense. Like, my local officials tell me they can't affect the value growth, and that explains my tax bill situation. Shucks, what do we do? Okay, what that ignores is that your local governing bodies have a lot of discretion in the rate setting process, right? So if your values go up, they have the discretion to bring your rates down, which mitigates the tax bill impact. In some cases, if they did it right, they could actually lower your tax bill. But they're not doing that because they're hiding behind the appraisal argument. And I just want to illustrate this. I love data, so I know I've probably hit you guys over the head with too much data, but I like to see what the numbers show because it is very revealing. And so one of the things that we've done over the last couple of weeks is we went and took a look at Austin's finances. I wanted to know, what have taxable values done in relation to the tax rates? Because that will tell me, has Austin even attempted to bring its rates down to compensate for the value growth? And here's what I found. From 2015 to 2024, the level of taxable value growth in the city rose by 138%. So lots of value growth. You can probably explain that through supply and demand and government regulation and some other market-related factors. But 138% growth in taxable value. Okay, so we know we have lots of value growth. What has the city done on the rate side to compensate for all of that growth? Well, they actually lowered the rates by 7.3%. Okay. A 7.3% reduction in your rate paired with a 138% value growth means that the city's tax levy, or the amount of money it's sucking out of the local economy, has grown by 121% over that 10-year period. Right? That's about a 12% growth every year. That tells you, the data tells you, they're not doing property taxes right. Right. There's some levers they can pull that they're not pulling.
And to compare that and to try to throw more numbers out there, but I think that was really important to go through. The next piece to compare that to is population and inflation.
Yes.
Which is what?
So population, we figure, well, gosh, we have a lot of growth. Maybe some of this tax bill increase is necessary. Well, population, the city's population increased only 17% between 15 and 24. And if you add the inflation measure, you're probably talking about 50% population and inflation increase over that period. So again, you compare that with 121% growth in taxes versus population and inflation increases of only 50%, and it's very obvious that things are way out of whack. Yeah. Austin is taking in far too much money, and they have no discipline.
It's a windfall. It's an absolute windfall for them to push this appraisal. Like you said, like the values of the house. They're just accepting it as like this massive windfall, and then turning around after all of this over the last decade, they then turn around, Jose, and say, "We're broke. We need another $100 million, and we're going to raise your taxes 20%. I mean, is it any wonder that this VATRE failed? I mean, I don't know that the average Austinite or the average Texan understands everything that we just discussed here in terms of the data and why you should absolutely vote against a tax increase or not support a tax increase. But they just feel it. They just absolutely feel it.
I think one way they feel it, and this factors into the appraisal reform part of the plan for the governor. He kicked off his announcement on Sunday by saying that we had a lot of success on the housing affordability front, and then he used that as a segue to talk about his tax plan. One of the things we're seeing is that, well, according to the Texas Comptroller, we have a shortage of 300,000 homes here in the state of Texas. So our housing supply is constrained. Supply is not keeping up with the population growth, and a lot of that is due to local regulations. You talk about the current minimum lot size. It's a patchwork of lot size regulations across the state. Permitting, impact fees, things of that nature, regulations at the local level that are preventing from that housing supply to increase, and it factors into the appraisal reform. I'd say if you think about the housing affordability package we passed, a lot of them dealt with those regulations. So here, as we implement those bills, such as SB 15, SB 840, we're going to see that increase in supply, not just in the outskirts, inside the city, where we're attempting to introduce more residential in the commercially zoned areas.
Here's what I'm worried about. I mean, yes, we all agree that supply is going to bring down the cost of housing, which would bring down the housing values, but this is going to keep going. I mean, it's going to take 5, 10. If we're lucky, it'll take 5 to 10 years to really see prices in a consistent way go down. But this, as long as this is happening and they're raising taxes far beyond what the growth of the city is, or population and inflation, that even the modicum of reduction that we see, even if it's significant, even if it plateaus and is a significant reduction, this plus the tax increases is going to wipe out any savings that we might have on our mortgages.
So by now, your audience is probably thinking, "Gosh, y'all are just picking on Austin. Y'all are just saying these things because Austin's the poster child for bad governance." And what I want to encourage the audience to do is, one, check me on these numbers, right? All of this information is publicly available. All you have to do is look at the latest annual comprehensive financial report for the city of Austin. But more than that, go and look at our August 2025 publication called Testimony to the Senate Committee on Local Government involving SB 9.
Catchy.
It is.
Nice.
I know. It's very catchy.
Everybody's going to remember that.
I did not comsify that title.
Maybe we can put that the link to that or something in the post.
I never professed to be a comms person. But if you look at the appendices in that document, what you'll find are 10 cities and 10 counties with very much the same information, looking at values, rates, population, and I believe per capita income. Right.
Yeah, one thing I would note about that is that, you said 17% growth in Austin, which is actually high. A lot of these places like Houston and Dallas and others have flatlined their population.
Yes. What you're seeing is the hollowing out of the urban core due to affordability issues. People cannot afford to live in the city proper anymore, so they're getting out of town.
Yeah.
I would say by and large, for those 20 jurisdictions that we pulled all of that information for a 10-year period, you see the very same pattern where values are up, rates are stagnant, population is either down just a smidge or flatlined, and tax bills are up, right? And so what all of this suggests to me, again, is that we have a local government spending problem that's being propped up by a property tax system that's being heavily manipulated.
Well said. We could sit here and talk about this for hours and hours. It's very complicated. It's very important that people understand it. So that's why I want to spend time with it. I do kind of want to get into. We're kind of coming to the end of the show. A little bit of a lightning round on the governor's plan, and there's some stuff in here that we have a ton of research on, and are things that we have endorsed in the past. So this is not we're not looking at the governor's plan and say we put our stamp of approval. Some of these things are things that we have testified on and supported in the past. But I do kind of want to do a lightning round for both of you and get kind of your initial thoughts on his plan, piece by piece as we go through, starting with maybe start with Jose, since you've been talking about elections and the need for voter approval. Any property tax rate, the first piece is any property tax rate increase, any property tax rate increase, so I want to make that clear, needs 2/3 of voters to say yes.
Couple of thoughts there. So that is a great part of the plan. We ran with a bill last session, SB 1209, that would have shifted all elections to the November uniform election date. So not just tax rate increase or school bonds, all elections to the November uniform election date. That was by Senator Brian Hughes. Came up short, didn't make it on the calendar. Bill died. But, it was interesting to see the opposition on this bill. So I have with me advocacy agendas for TML and TASB. And I'll read straight from them.
Texas Municipal League and the Texas Association of School Boards. Yeah.
So Texas Municipal League has on their advocacy agenda from this past session, they oppose the elimination of the current uniform election dates. So it's broadly enough that they can oppose anything on that end. TASB is a little more explicit. So TASB says, I'll read, TASB opposes legislation that increases ballot language requirements, limits dates upon which elections may be held, creates additional requirements for voter-approved tax rate elections, bond elections, such as voter turnout thresholds. So I think that's an important part of the plan because it ties into not just voter turnout, but it also impedes a lot of the folks that are heavily invested in these elections, especially the May elections.
Yeah.
When you get a lot of these bonds that are passing with less than 5% turnout.
Yeah, James, to your point earlier about, states have carte blanche authority to set the rules for how these things go. They could. I mean, this isn't, a lot of people came out, attacking this plan, saying it's, it's too strict or too harsh. They could go, Abbott could go full draconian and say, if 50% of your registered voters don't show up, it doesn't matter if it's a majority or not a majority. If 50% of your people don't turn out, you can't increase taxes, period. They could do that. That's not anything that he's doing here. All he's saying is that when you have the election, 2/3 of the people have to support it rather than a simple majority.
Yeah, that's right. The legislature is well within its ambit to modify those election requirements as they see fit, right? Mm-hmm. They are the author and creator of those political subdivisions, and they alone have sovereignty in all of this. Now, one of the things we've done over the last couple of weeks is we're trying to figure out how would some of these supermajority requirements have affected previous elections. And so I'm working with the policy team right now to run some hypotheticals using actual election outcomes, and then consider some different scenarios. Like if we had a 60% threshold, how would that have affected those elections? 66%, 75%. Hope to publish that research soon to really punctuate how a proposal like this might affect things moving forward based on past examples.
Let's jump into, this one is pretty, not necessarily controversial, but it's pretty bold. So maybe that's what makes it controversial. Eliminating the M&O school tax. And just, this is, this again, the grassroots, eliminate property taxes. This would, for the most part, satisfy, this very strong call, particularly from the conservative grassroots, to eliminate property taxes. How does that even work, James?
This is a good question. So the governor has not yet articulated his approach, so I'll just substitute in my own thoughts. What I think the legislature is preparing to do is pass a constitutional amendment, which would have to be ratified by voters, directing future legislatures to appropriate a certain percentage of surplus monies. So let's think about 2029 and beyond. All of those legislatures would have to take, let's say, 90% of surplus tax revenue and dedicate it to reducing the ISD M&O tax rate. Mm-hmm. And the goal would be to get that rate down to zero and hold it there in perpetuity. Now, I think that's the right approach. We need to do it. One thing that we, as a movement, need to give serious thought to is that school districts have all of these silly ways to raise that tax rate back up.
Yeah.
Right. Whether that's through bonds or golden pennies or copper pennies or, some
fees,
other magic that they have. We have to get those things under control. Otherwise, the efforts that the legislature is getting ready to undertake are going to be either diminished or upended entirely by local action.
Yeah, no, I've written about this. I've talked about it ad nauseum on the podcast, but the whole stealing our tax cuts, it is a very real thing, and the local governments are completely brazen about it. The legislature over the last 3 sessions has passed $51 billion in property tax relief. None of us have seen any of that because the locals, for the most part, the locals look at it and say, oh, well, you're going to get a $600 tax cut? Well, I'll just finagle the numbers so that it looks like you pay the same from the previous year. Meanwhile, we'll take the extra money. Instead of you getting a $600 tax cut, we'll just take that. You'll pay the same, and we'll say, oh, hey, that you didn't have a tax increase. That's great. Meanwhile, they're collecting all that money that should be going back into our pockets, and it's insidious. It's a real problem.
So all of these voter approval tax rate elections are proof of that point. Because these governments, they see an opportunity to move in with an aggressive tax increase, knowing, wow, most people probably aren't paying attention. They're only looking at the top line number. So we can come in and edge some of their tax cut away. They probably won't be the wiser. You see that with both VATREs and bonds alike.
Jose will jump down to appraisal caps, going from, I think they're at 10% right now and getting down to 3%. So locking in a 3% annual growth cap on appraisals on all properties, including rental and commercial. This one doesn't feel like the most free markety thing in the entire world, but it certainly is one of those issues that we just talked about. Is how they play the game with the appraisals. It's necessary to lock this in to stop them.
Yeah, and you mentioned early on when you started that there's a lot of support for this. So I think the plan as a whole has a lot of support from folks who may have been opposed to this in the past. I can tell you that TML is against this. That's always very telling. We ran with this not last session, but the session before that, and I think what the governor is seeing is that there is support for this, at least more support than there was 2 years ago. And the plan as a whole, if you include the appraisal caps, I think it complements the rest of the plan very well.
James, I'll pitch to you the spending limit, the spending caps. You've talked about this already.
Love it.
Yeah, so this is basically what we've talked about, capping local government growth at population plus inflation or 3.5, whichever is lower. Mm-hmm. And so you can't, and this is the spending, right? This is the spending growth. Is that right? Yeah, spending limit. Yep. So we're getting to the spending side, and we're saying you can't increase past 3.5% or population plus inflation, whichever is lower.
So I would actually encourage the governor to think a little bit broader in one respect. A spending limit is great, but we need to complement that with other strict fiscal rules like a debt limit and a balanced budget requirement. Mm-hmm. We need to have a complement of different rules and requirements placed upon the local government budgeting process so that there's not an easy path to circumvent any sort of spending limit that's put into effect. Because if we've learned anything over the last several years, it's that local officials are evasive, they're creative, and they will find a way around your law, whatever you do. And so you have to layer one requirement on top of another to get the sort of behavior from them that you desire.
We have polled this particular policy before because it's been an idea that's been out there. 67% of Texans support local spending caps. 67 to only 24%. 67% support local spending caps. Okay, back to appraisals.
Real quick, before we get there, I want to be careful about calling it a cap because the past proposals that we've put forward are not caps. They are triggers, right? The governmental entity would have the ability to exceed any limitation put into effect with a vote of the people. So they can get whatever they want to spend, just like with the property tax, but they have to get voter affirmation. Mm-hmm. So if we want to do a cap, I'm actually in support of that, and I would love it, but let's make it a hard cap, no voter election element. You get 2% more per year, period. Go figure it out. Yeah. But in this case, I think what's being discussed is more of a trigger.
Okay, so we're going back to appraisals, switching to appraisals once every 5 years. Is it only once every 5 years? So you can't do appraisals more than once in 5 years is the concept.
Yeah. So this reminds me of that old Thomas Sowell quote where he says, in policy, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And when you think about the goal here, I think it's a worthy goal. Really what we're trying to do is provide homeowners with certainty and relief. But you have to think about where that shifts the pressure to in the system. And I think if a policy like this were to go into effect, you have the potential consequence for that energy to move to the commercial side and the multifamily side. So your renters and your business owners would probably absorb some of the extra tax burden as a result of instituting a limitation of that sort. This is one reason, kind of some of the pros and cons here is one reason why we have intentionally focused on rates and revenues in the past, because really at the core of that, you want to limit how much money government is sucking out of the economy and or spending. Mm-hmm. Those are the two things you really need to be laser focused on.
And on the appraisals, this wouldn't preclude you from selling your house for whatever you wanted to sell it for. I mean, just because 3 years ago your house was appraised at, $500,000 doesn't mean you couldn't sell it for $750,000 if the market had changed and things were hot. It's not. I mean, it may affect the a buyer's ability to get a loan for $750,000.
So there may be some unintended consequences that we're not even thinking about. So, for example, if we move to a 5-year reappraisal system, would that perhaps incentivize people to do improvements at a certain time and sell on year 4.5 right before they get that big value increase? I don't know. But those are things that need to be taken into account when considering policies.
Well, it's good that it's part of the plan, so at least we'll have that discussion. And then the final one, and this is really my favorite, I think this is the most foundational and the most groundbreaking, is that it would let we have I'm gonna do my bad impression of James on this one, but the fact is we have all these elections to increase taxes. We have all these elections to decide whether or not we should spend more. Why don't we have an election or a voter-triggered election to cut taxes? What about a election to cut spending? Why can't we have those? Why can't we have the public is fed up with the sweet greens and all of the bad spending and the homeless murals and all that kind of stuff? Why can't the public initiate spending cuts or tax decreases? Well, that's the final piece of Abbott's plan, letting 15% of registered voters trigger a vote to cut tax rates, a direct check on overspending. Did I explain that right, or is there more details to that?
I love this proposal, and I am ready to go to war for it because it is such a phenomenal idea. And I've given some thought to how this might even work. And we've done some really early sketches of perhaps crafting a piece of legislation that allows people to petition for a tax cut election affecting cities and counties. And so you could well imagine a scenario where a group of rabble-rousers get together and they get enough signatures to force a 3-cent tax rate reduction for a city and a 3-cent tax rate reduction for a county. 6-cent reduction in total that is pitched to the voters, right? And that would provide folks with some meaningful relief. Now, so as not to surprise the government with a tax cut in the middle of a fiscal year, what you would do is you'd structure it so that it would hit in the next fiscal year, right? And I think that would give governments time to plan and figure out, well, what are the things that we need to spend less on? But a mechanism of that sort is not only needed, but it also finally, I think, decentralizes some of the tax cut energy that is primarily centered at the legislature right now, right? So everybody generally looks to the legislature to cut taxes, even though local governments are imposing the taxes, and they alone have the rate-setting discretion to actually cut them in your community. We still look to the legislature to get it done. This would take some of that initiative, put it in the hands of voters, of those people who live in the communities, which is the truest form of local control, by the way, right? Putting power in the hands of voters to get it done, and then letting the community decide, do we have too much government or is it fine?
Jose, do you think you could rally 15% of your neighbors to cut their own taxes?
So when I saw this plank in the governor's plan, I immediately thought this is the epitome of taxpayer empowerment. This is the one that empowers the people to have a say, have a place at the table. So I think this is the one that's going to your point, garner the most excitement out of all the planks with the public, legislators, and everyone that's interested in lowering our property taxes.
Final thought, because we've gone way over time, but this is great. I'm glad I think we hit all of the major issues. Final thought, when Abbott came out on Sunday and talked about this plan, he used the exact same kind of language that he did whenever he made his case for school choice. And he said, we can do this the hard way or we can do this the easy way, which I think for the movement and conservatives across Texas, we said, he's getting behind property taxes the way he got behind school choice, and we of course know what the outcome was there. So does that, just in general, obviously that's very encouraging. I'm not going to ask you to, that's very encouraging for us. But is this, school choice was like this intractable problem that we had for 40 years, and it was a national embarrassment that we didn't have it, and we finally got across the finish line. Property taxes feels like that a lot, Jose. Do you think that we'll have the same kind of progress in the same amount of quick amount of time? This next session or 2 sessions from now? What do you think the prospects are for getting some of this stuff across the finish line?
Very good question. So I think there's going to be a lot of copy and paste from the school choice plan. It's not exactly the same. So school choice had the big, beautiful bill. This is going to be multiple shots, right? Yeah. The governor's plan calls for 4 or 5 items. And what's not to say that some of those points are going to have multiple bills. So in that end, I think it might be multiple sessions where we get some of it done this upcoming session and we get the rest of it done the following session.
James, same thing, or what do we think prospects are?
I'm incredibly optimistic about the eventual passage of most, if not all, of these measures. The most obvious reason why is everybody has affordability on their mind. The other thing that's kind of lurking in the background that I hope conservatives recognize is that we have too much government in Texas. And what I mean is both numerically, if you look at the number of property taxing units sprinkled all throughout the state, we've got about 5,000 little bloodsuckers out there that are all one layered upon another, right? That's second only to Illinois. So we have the second most number of local governments anywhere in the nation. Too much government on that front. And they're also too active. They're doing too much. And you can look at the Death Star law and all of the potential effect that it might have to reverse some of the damage that progressives have done to taxpayers in that regard. But it's very clear we need to go further. We need to refocus local government only on core services and get them out of the business of progressive activism. If we do those 2 things and we go into the next session with that mindset, then we can fundamentally reorder local government in a positive way that not only gets them back to basics, but also alleviates the tax burden.
Well said, and it always too many Star Wars references. We got Vaders, we got Death Stars. It always comes back to the Death Star Cup at some point. Well, James, Jose, this has been awesome. I mean, again, there's a lot to cover here, so I hope people found this pretty informative. And I think you guys both have a really great way of explaining it and breaking it down for people. We look forward to you continue to communicate on these issues. We look forward to whatever Governor Abbott is going to do to push these issues forward. We'll obviously be releasing our agenda here pretty soon that will cover a lot of these kinds of things. And then next year, there'll be just an absolute mad dash and a push to do whatever we can possibly do to address these property tax issues and get them down. So thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
All right. And thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. And in the immortal words of Sam Houston, do good and risk the consequences. We'll see you next time.